Hey folks, welcome back to chapter 5. So we're starting in on the macronutrients and we're starting with carbohydrates, which include sugars, starches, and fiber. So nutrition fashions and trends come and go, but it seems that for at least the 5 last years or so, there's been a lot of focus on how bad carbohydrates are for you. Well, we'll dive into the science behind the good, the bad, and the ugly or very unhealthy kinds of carbohydrates, as well as the healthy kinds of carbohydrates, because there's a lot of healthy carbohydrates out there as well. So, when we're talking about carbohydrates, we're almost entirely talking about plant foods. Animal foods, with the exception of most, but not all dairy, does not contain carbohydrates. So if you think of something like a steak or chicken breast or shrimp, they do not contain carbohydrates. Animals store excess energy as fat. Us animals store very little carbohydrate. In the case of humans, just a few hundred grams. Plants are the opposite. So plants, with a few exceptions, store very little energy as fat and almost all of it as carbohydrates. And so that's where we're getting most of our carbohydrates from. I like to joke that in this chapter we have the secret of life here. So really the basis of life on Earth is this process, magical process of photosynthesis. So the sun's energy catalyzes the reaction between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and water, which would be coming up from the soil, sometimes also water vapor, like morning dew. And that from that two things, we can form glucose. I'm sorry, not we, plants can form glucose. So if you look below, glucose, which is one of our carbohydrates, one of our monosaccharides, it has a simple 6 carbon structure, and the chemical bonds, which are the bars, that represents the energy contained in glucose. So on the previous slide, I showed the chemical structure of one type of monosaccharide, glucose. The other two are fructose and galactose. They're very similar in structure, also 6 carbon rings with just hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. Here we can see the details of how closely these three are related. You could just take a quick look and gosh, they're almost the same, right? Very, very similar structure, all contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in slightly different arrangements, but they actually all have the same chemical formula. So C6H12O6. Glucose is considered the body's energy currency, and it's all over the food supply, as most carbohydrates found in food can be broken down into glucose units. Fructose, which is mostly in fruit, honey, and some vegetables, can be converted to glucose in the body, more specifically in the liver, but forms a much smaller part of the overall dietary intake than glucose. And galactose even smaller still, because galactose we really only get from dairy products. So those were the monosaccharides in the previous slide, and then here we're looking at a step up in complexity. So these are disaccharides, which are just what the name implies, di meaning two, saccharide meaning sugar. So you have two monosaccharides linked together, and that forms a disaccharide. And you can think when you're chewing just like a simple wheat cracker in your mouth, you're tasting the disaccharide maltose because in your mouth, we're already starting to break down some of the longer chain carbohydrates into maltose. Carbohydrates are closely linked to water, H2O, right? Remember that the earlier slide where we show that sunlight and water form glucose with the energy from photosynthesis providing the energy to make the chemical reaction. So when monosaccharides join together, a little bit of that water is released. And you can see how that works here on the slide. An important note when we talk about one of the most common and not so healthy carbohydrates in the diet, sugar, it's worth considering that the making of sugar is a complex industrial process. And in the past century or so, we've become incredibly efficient at making sugar and different kinds of sweeteners very closely related to sugar. And we can produce large quantities very cheaply. But throughout human history, it was far more difficult and expensive to produce sweeteners. And as we talk about some of the negative health effects of sugar, just in the big picture, Homo sapiens, our species, just didn't evolve with much access to these kinds of simple carbohydrates. So we don't do well when we consume a lot of them. So when you look at this chart, the first thing you should note is that the portion size here, it's just 1 tablespoon, right? So everything in this category, 1 tablespoon of honey, white sugar, maple syrup, corn syrup, brown sugar, molasses, all of these different kinds of sweeteners are between 50 and 60 some calories, right? And we're talking about 1 tablespoon. It's a very small amount. So that's about the calories in a small apple. One of the issues with all sweeteners is that they're very calorie dense, meaning that you can easily consume 200 calories of a sweetener, for instance, in a beverage, or it could be in a cookie, and you won't feel full from that 200 calories in the same way that you would feel full from 200 calories worth of carrots, apples, or brown rice, which really has a lot of structure and also fiber, which helps make you feel full. So that's kind of one of the primary issues health-wise with sweeteners. They're very easy to consume in large quantities. A interesting and really important side note in the book, and this is kind of one of the things I always love about nutrition, is that it really intersects with so many other parts of life and science. And bees and other pollinators, for instance, there are certain insects and bats which are pollinators, their populations have been declining over the past few decades. And there's a great deal of concern over this as these pollinators make our agricultural systems far more productive. Farmers actually pay beekeepers to come out to their fields to pollinate crops to increase the impact of pollinators, of the natural pollinators. So they see a lot more agricultural production if they bring out beekeepers into their fields and sometimes other pollinators into their fields. Right now, there's a lot of interesting research going on that's looking at what might be causing populations of bees and other pollinators to decline. Likely, it has something to do with pollution, certain toxins in our air, water supply, and possibly certain agricultural chemicals that are impacting the lifespans and reproductivity of bees and other pollinators. High fructose corn syrup has gotten a lot of bad press over the years, but the real key takeaway when considering this broad category of calorie-containing sweeteners, which high fructose syrup is one example of many, it's just to know that their consumption has gone up greatly over the past century or so, and the impacts of that excess have contributed to chronic disease and obesity. And one simple way you can think of it is, since sweeteners don't take up much volume, and you can consume several hundred calories worth of sweeteners in a few tablespoons, we don't decrease our intake of other foods. So it just adds a lot of calories, and calories are fairly empty. So that can contribute to, for instance, diabetes and heart disease. So everything on this table, broadly speaking, is nutritionally similar. Yes, some of these sweeteners have a little bit more beneficial properties. For instance, molasses has iron in it, and brown sugar has a couple minerals in it. But all of these are very nutritionally similar, and it's very easy to consume any of these in excess, and they all have essentially the same consequences. So everything we looked at in the past slide falls into this category of nutritive sweeteners, meaning they contain calories, all the same, 4 calories per gram. Um, as opposed to non-nutritive sweeteners like aspartame or Splenda, for instance. These are sweet, but they don't contain calories. We consume a lot of sweeteners in the American diet. And when I worked in public health clinics, when I worked with folks who had chronic disease and obesity, this was always one of the first areas I would tackle with patients. I mean, for instance, breakfast. If I could get a patient to, instead of having something sweet like a donut or pastry with coffee that would have cream and sugar in it, if I could get them to have just something simple, eggs and toast with some tomato slices and a cup of tea with no sweetener. Little changes like that made a huge difference, and also especially with beverages. So that would be one of the first areas I'd work on with patients, trying to go from beverages that have a lot of sweeteners in them to beverages that have less or ideally no sweeteners. And a lot of patients made a lot of progress on these dietary issues and would greatly improve their health with just a couple little changes here and there. So, in the category of sweeteners, there's alternative sweeteners, and they're substances that sweeten foods while providing few or no calories. So, for instance, here we're looking at the alcohol sugars. So, sorbitol, xylitol, mannitol. One benefit is since there's um, no easily fermentable sugar, it doesn't land on your teeth and promote tooth decay. So these are good options. For instance, now you'll see almost every gum out there has one of these alcohol sweeteners in them because just to help reduce tooth decay. Uh, they have a little bit of calories, but they're not really fully absorbed by the intestinal tract. So, which is both a positive in terms of weight gain, but negative in that if, for instance, you get eat a handful of mannitol sweetened chocolate, nuggets or something, you can get some uh, substantial digestive discomfort like diarrhea, gas, and bloating. If you keep it to a relatively small amount, you're usually fine though. So another category of sweeteners that I mentioned briefly earlier, things like Splenda, Equal, Sweet and Low, these are in the category of non-nutritive sweeteners, and they're very, very strong. Of course, they don't quite taste, they don't quite act like the nutritive sweeteners in terms of texture and their role in cooking. But they can be useful for some people who are maybe diabetic or trying to lose weight. Also, in the fact that they don't create tooth decay. In this photo, you'll also see stevia and truvia, which is just a kind of stevia. I'd consider that a slight step up maybe from the Splenda and Equal. That is non-nutritive, but it's actually from a plant. So it's a bit more natural than some of the other options. So this is just looking at a little bit more detail here. So these artificial sweeteners like aspartame, saccharin, sucralose, which is Splenda, um, really, really potent sweeteners. And for instance, I use stevia sometimes. I have some of the, I've actually used the plant stevia, and you can just drop a couple leaves into a tea and it makes it sweet, or you can use the purified powder, and then it's incredibly potent. You need a very small amount. So, and sometimes with these sweeteners, they'll add bulking agents, um, which will make the sweetener appear a little bit larger, just so that people don't use too much. This is an area of quite a bit of controversy, and you'll see most nutrition textbooks will address the safety of non-nutritive sweeteners with some cautious wording, essentially saying that there have been some studies that have shown some possible correlations with health effects, but very conclusive evidence that non-nutritive sweeteners are unhealthy is difficult to find. I'd say probably used in some degree of moderation are probably okay, and there also could be some range of sensitivities where maybe it's not as good for some people as others. It's still an area of a bit of mystery in nutrition, and also sometimes when you're working clinically with patients, it's what is the least bad option. So when you have someone who has, for instance, very out of control blood sugar, very poorly managed diabetes, going from a lot of sweetened, sugar sweetened foods a day to these non-nutritive sweeteners can have some immediate benefits. So this slide addresses that concept of what are safe limits. And you can see these are really, really large amounts. I mean, I don't know anyone who's consuming, 18 to 19 cans of Diet Coke a day. But yeah, my guess is that you're probably better off doing a whole lot less than that. So just a couple of important definitions here. We talked about mono and disaccharides, which are the simple carbohydrates, right? One and two sugar units joined, one or two sugar units joined together. And here we're talking about complex carbohydrates. So the broad category is polysaccharides. So anything where you have three or more monosaccharides bonded together. And we'll go into a bit more detail in a bit, but a subcategory there is oligosaccharides, and that's between 3 to 10 monosaccharides, and two examples are raffinose and stacchose, which are act a bit more like fiber in the body than most carbohydrates. And we'll talk about fiber here in a minute too. So these oligosaccharides, which are common in certain vegetables and legumes, they're non-digestible, and so when they reach the large intestine, bacteria uses them for energy. This is basically very healthy for your body, but if people change their diet rapidly and aren't used to intaking a lot of vegetables, this is one of the reasons why you can get a little bit of digestive discomfort like gas. Usually the digestive system can adjust to changes in diet over time, but especially at first you'll get a bit more gas when you include more vegetables in your diet. Although that goes down a bit as if they're cooked as opposed to raw. So I mentioned earlier, animals don't store a lot of energy in the form of carbohydrate in the body, but we do store a few hundred grams, about a day or so's worth of carbohydrate for energy, and most of that's in the liver and the muscles, and that's in a form called glycogen. So similar to the word glucose, but glucose that is compact, stored together in those two organ systems. Um, in plants, we have most of excess energy being stored as starch. So that's the mainstay of a lot of diets, right? Bread and cereal products, vegetables, which can include vegetables that are higher in starch. For instance, corn and peas, potatoes have a lot of starch, and vegetables that have a lot less starch. And more fiber and water, things like broccoli and cauliflower, onions, that kind of thing. But regardless of the source and the precise type of carbohydrate, it produces 4 calories per gram. So this is just looking at the way um, plants store carbohydrates versus humans. Um, Humans store carbohydrate as glycogen, which is really highly branched, and that is highly branched so that we can break off pieces of glucose as we need for energy. Plants, the sources of storage of starch are usually a little bit less branched than glycogen. So, jumping into the topic of fiber, which is so incredibly important, fiber we don't digest. So, sometimes people say, if we don't digest it, how in the world is it good for our health? Well, we'll get into that, but it's incredibly healthy. Fiber is a carbohydrate that plants use to make all sorts of structures. So, there are two different kinds. Soluble fiber, that's forms of fiber that dissolve or swell up in water. So pectins, gums, mucilages, some hemicelluloses, and then insoluble fiber, that's forms of dietary fiber that don't dissolve in water. So cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin. Um, just showing a little bit of the chemical structure here. So the key word on this slide is digestible and indigestible. So on the top, the starches, you see the bond between the two carbohydrate units is something that human digestive enzymes can snip apart, and then we can break up the longer chain polysaccharides into short chain and then into just individual di and monosaccharides. Fiber down there on the second image, that has a form of bond that is between the different saccharide units that human enzymes cannot break down. So we can metabolize some of those in the large intestine, um, and that actually can feed gut microbiota, which is really healthy for the large intestine. But for the most part, the fiber passes through our body undigested. So some of these medium chain saccharides, which we talked about between 3 and 9 units long, are sold to us as supplements called prebiotics. And actually, if we just eat a healthy diet, we get a fair amount of prebiotics. But what that means, prebiotic as opposed to probiotic, that's substances that our bacteria in our large intestine feed upon, and that increases the health of our digestive tract. Also, with really any kind of fiber, we have volume, and that's satisfying, that makes us feel less hungry, and our digestive tract is working, burning calories to break things down, but we aren't intaking calories. So fiber in general helps with weight control. So if we look at the two different kinds of fiber, and most foods that have fiber have a little bit of mix of both, although some foods will have a little bit more of one than the other. They tend to come in similar packages. Insoluble fiber increases fecal bulk, and that means the stool is bigger, which is really good for the health of the digestive tract. It makes it easier to pass. So you're less likely to have those kind of constipated little rabbit pellet kind of stools that are hard to pass. It makes the stool bigger, easier to pass. It also helps keep the digestive tract healthy because those bigger stools exercise the muscle of the digestive tract. And that's also, again, something that helps us feel full. We have all this volume of food, extra volume. If you think of the difference in volume between, a simple pasta versus a pasta that has, broccoli and tomato in it. The broccoli and tomato are mostly fiber and water. They add very little calories, but that bulk helps us feel full. Soluble fiber So that swells up in water. That delays stomach emptying. So the longer the stomach is full, the more we feel full. So um, it helps us feel full for longer, and it also lowers blood sugar. It gives a more even blood sugar response and lowers blood cholesterol because the soluble fiber binds up some cholesterol in our digestive tract. So you can see below the definition between whole grain products and refined grain products. But what I've mentioned here is that in a lot of other cultures, they eat a lot of whole grains, not just whole grain or grain products, but for instance, in Latin America, a great deal of corn. Um, Corn is a whole grain, not just corn products, but actual corn. In Europe, barley is quite popular, just whole grain barley. But here in the States, we are a bit more fans of products made from grains. So if you can go to the whole grain, you're even better off. But if you're going to products made out of grains, look for whole grains. So, for instance, 100% whole wheat bread as opposed to a bread that's made out of mostly refined white flour. And some of those breads will say multigrain and they'll be mostly refined white flour and they might have, just a little couple grams of oats and flax so they can put multigrain on the label. Always good to look closely at the labels. So if you look at a kernel of wheat, which you see here on this slide, and this would be the same for any kind of grain, could be barley or quinoa or rice. Grains have three basic parts, or actually four. The fourth part is the husk, which is the outer layer, which isn't identified on the slide. But um, the husk is just something that is used usually for animal feed. Um, Inside the husk, you have the bran, which is the outer layer, and the bran is mostly fiber. And inside that, you have the endosperm, which is carbohydrates, and that is what we make white flour from, just from the endosperm. So we take the bran off, um, and we just make it out of the endosperm. There's another part called the germ, and the germ has some vitamins, some healthy fats, and minerals, but we don't use that when we make refined white flour. And so the question is, well, why would we do this if we're losing out on these important nutrients? Well, we started refining grains because refined grains have a much longer shelf life. Um, they don't go bad as quick, which is really economically advantageous. They have a much shorter cooking time, which people love. And people also, in general, they like the taste a lot. It's a little bit sweeter, it's a little less, well, to pardon the expression, grainier. You don't have to chew it as much. And before the understanding of the nutritional disadvantages of refining grains was well understood, um, these things, the shelf life, the shorter cooking time, the taste, led to widespread adoption of refining grains. So when you see a bread label, consider that all you need actually to make bread is flour made from a grain, usually wheat or mostly wheat, water, salt, and yeast. Just those four ingredients. You can even make bread without yeast. For instance, that is how the best natural sourdoughs are made. They just take longer when you don't add yeast. If any of you have Netflix, by the way, there's a great documentary miniseries called Cooked, Cooked, and they have a whole 1 hour episode on bread, which is really great. Um, Anyhow, so anything beyond those basic ingredients is extra. And in this case, you see a whole lot of sweeteners. Fiber is one of the most important markers for overall health. So when you see that the typical American eats way less fiber than recommendations, this is a serious red flag in the realm of public health. Most of this is due to a lack of eating vegetables. Vegetables have a whole lot of fiber, and also our culture in the U.S., we don't eat many whole grains. Like the previous slides showed, and other slides, we go for more refined grains. So possible health consequences of this habit include poor digestive health, right? Poor, especially large intestine health, obesity, and increased blood sugars. So as you go from a whole food to a refined food, the fiber drops. An example there would be looking at a raw apple versus applesauce versus apple juice. So the more we can eat things in the whole foods form, generally the better for health. I'm so glad the book jumps into this little segment. Beans and legumes in general are incredibly healthy foods, and a lot of people avoid them because of a fear of gas, bloating, digestive disturbances, and these are avoidable. Soaking beans overnight and then throwing out the water you soak them in, that helps a great deal. I do that, and then the next day when I cook beans or lentils or split peas, I add bay leaves, which help with digestion, and a seaweed called kombu, Kombu. You can just add a very little bit, also add some minerals. And just something to keep in mind in general, that anytime you change your diet, your digestive tract has a little bit of an added challenge. So it's good to change your diet slowly, let your digestive tract adjust. I spent several years working in Latin America, and in the rural areas, people still eat quite a high fiber diet. A lot of corn, beans, veggies, some fruit, and they're quite healthy in those rural areas and quite a bit slimmer than the people who are eating the more modern diets. It's a very high carbohydrate diet, partially because animal foods are just too expensive for the rural poor to eat in any significant quantities. So it's not necessarily that they're choosing those foods because they want them, but it's actually a really inexpensive diet. They're growing their own corn, beans, veggies, and they eat the fruit when it's in season. So building off that, it's much more the quality than the quantity that matters. So in the US, we don't eat a particularly high carbohydrate diet. When you look at the AMDR for carbohydrate, it's 45 to 65% is the recommendations, and we eat close to the minimum. But it's the quality that matters. We're eating a lot of refined carbohydrates. Whereas you could eat a diet that's 65% carbohydrates, and if they're from unrefined sources, as I mentioned in the previous slide, things like legumes and whole grains, veggies, fruit, you're going to be doing really well, even though you're on a quote unquote high carbohydrate diet. So looking at the amount of sugar we eat in a day, this is really one of the most significant changes in the history of Homo sapien diets. Just really in the last 100 or so years, there's been a vast increase in the amount of sugars and sweeteners in our diet. And if you're interested in food history, this is a really fascinating area. The sugar industry is kind of an incredible story involving slavery in the 15th, 16th, 17th century when the industry was really ramping up, beginning. Before that, people just hardly ate any sugar. And this involves the beginning of vast international networks, early international trade. For instance, a lot of early sugar industry was in the Caribbean, places like Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. Also, interesting early examples of industrialized farming, plantations, and early industrial food processing. One of the easiest ways to improve a diet is to simply stop drinking calories or drinking a lot less calories. The issue with sweeteners is they make everything taste better, right? We're not consuming all these sweeteners because it's good for our health, of course. It's because of our tastes. However, it's really important to keep in mind taste buds can change. So just as they've changed over the past 100 or so years to become much more acclimated to a very sweet diet, they can change back and people can acclimate to much less sweet diets. And I've seen that happen many, many times. So with the advice below on the slide, what I'd recommend is go slowly. And I'll tell you a story from working with type 2 diabetics, peds, so children with type 2 diabetes, 10, 12, 14 years old, and talking with their parents about, hey, instead of giving them juice, what you want to do every single day, increase the amount of water and decrease the amount of juice very, very little bit. So do like a 5% change a day. And by the end of the month, you're just painting the water with juice. You might have whatever, a 12-ounce glass of juice and 1 ounce is water. And if you do it slowly, the kids never notice. It's really amazing. Taste buds will acclimate. So I really recommend going slowly with pretty much every dietary change. Okay, jumping into carbohydrate digestion. So we begin digestion in the mouth. So we have some chemical digestion where we have the salivary amylase converts some of the starches in carbohydrate foods into maltose. Remember that disaccharide. Um, so from the mouth, we go to the stomach, but in the stomach, there is no carbohydrate digestion going on. So we'll skip the stomach and we'll go right into the small intestine. The small intestine is kind of where it all happens for, or most of the digestion happens for carbohydrates. We have the pancreas releasing pancreatic amylase, which helps break down the starch into more maltose molecules. The maltase is the specific enzyme that breaks the maltose into two glucose molecules. And likewise, you have sucrase, lactase. So you notice that these are variations on the word sucrose and lactose. So when you see the ASE, you're talking about a digestive enzyme. So just going into a brief look at how that looks on a chemical level. So we have the disaccharides linked together, right? The maltose. You add the digestive enzyme maltase and you get two glucose units. So you break apart the disaccharide into two monosaccharide units. Same thing with the sucrose and the lactose. So absorption of monosaccharides mainly occurs there in the small intestine. So once they're in those single units, they can cross into our bloodstream. So they join into the capillary network and they're transported to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. So one thing I forgot to mention in the earlier slides is once the molecules pass over the blood barrier into the body, we're talking about absorption. So digestion is everything that happens to a food to break it down into small enough molecules, in this case, the monosaccharides, where those monosaccharides can then cross over that brush border in the small intestine and they can get into the capillary system and become part of our body. That's absorption. So important distinction between digestion and absorption. And here we're just looking at going from that small intestine where the absorption is taking place through the hepatic portal vein into the liver. So some of this we've talked about a little bit earlier, but fiber, a type of carbohydrate, right, in the broader category of carbohydrates, we don't digest that in the small intestine. It moves on to the large intestine where our gut bacteria ferment soluble fiber, and we can break some of that down into energy, while the insoluble fiber does not entirely break down, and that contributes to the bulk of our feces or stool, and that makes the stool easier to pass. So that's one of the ways fiber really is super healthy for us. Resistant starches act kind of like fibers. Uh, there are starches found in some carbohydrate foods that resist digestion and are not broken down just like fiber. And there's some interesting research on resistant starches and how they are, where they are found in the diet and how they're formed. And for instance, certain ways we cook and store food increase the resistance of starch. For instance, if you have pasta one night and you have leftovers, the pasta cools down in the refrigerator and you reheat it, there's actually more resistant starch in it the following day. So, in some ways, leftovers can be good for you then. And same with baked potatoes and actually quite a few different carbohydrate foods. So this is a really useful slide that uh, covers kind of everything we've been talking about. So just a little review, what happens to carbohydrates in the mouth, what does not happen to carbohydrates in the stomach, right? Because not much happens there. Then looking at what happens in the small intestine, which we just went over, what the liver's role is, what the large intestine's role is, and then, of course, what happens in the rectum, the final stage. Okay, talking a little bit about the hormonal aspects of carbohydrate digestion. So, two super important hormones, insulin and glucagon. So, um, these help manage to keep our blood glucose levels at a very even level. Since this is an incredibly important nutrient, having the blood glucose go either too low or too high is very detrimental to human health. So, um, when we need more blood sugar, the body releases insulin. So that's released from the beta cells of the pancreas, and that contributes to a decrease in blood glucose levels. So the insulin is pulling the glucose out of our blood and putting it into the cells of our body. When blood sugar rises, or when we need a rise in blood sugar, the body releases glucagon. That hormone secreted from the alpha cells of the pancreas, and that hormone tells the cells of the body to break down stores of glucose and release them into the blood, and that raises blood sugar levels. So insulin decreases blood sugar levels, glucagon raises blood sugar levels. One way you can picture how this works is insulin is essentially a key that opens up the cells of our bodies to accept glucose. So when insulin is released, our cells pull in glucose from the blood. Without insulin, we can't do that. Glucagon, which is kind of the sister hormone to insulin, works in the opposite way. Has a couple different ways to increase glucose levels in the bloodstream. Um, so when glucose levels in the bloodstream drop, the body releases glucagon, and glucagon can act a few different ways. So it can stimulate the liver and the kidneys to produce glucose from certain amino acids. That's gluconeogenesis, meaning making new glucose. It stimulates the breakdown of glucose from fat stores, which is lipolysis, so breaking down fat and um, turning that fat into glycerol and fatty acids, which are released into the bloodstream, which can be used for some energy. And and particularly liver can use glycerol, which is part of fats, for gluconeogenesis, and some cells can also use fatty acids for energy. So this is going into what do typical blood sugars look like. So um, for instance, after a meal, you might have a blood sugar of about 140. The pancreas releases insulin, glucose enters the cells, the blood sugar keeps dropping, and normal range of blood sugar somewhere between 70 to 100. Um, Meaning not close to meal times, though. So as blood glucose drops a fair amount, when it gets somewhere around 70, 75 milligrams per deciliter, then the pancreas releases glucagon. The glucagon will then encourage the breakdown of the stored glucose, which is called glycogen, right? Stored in the liver and the muscle cells, to glucose. That glucose gets released, and then the blood sugar rises. So the body's always seeking that homeostasis. And when you test your blood sugar, it's important to test it to note how recent the last meal was, because uh, normal blood sugar range, approximately 2 hours after a meal, you want that blood sugar to be somewhere between 70 and 100. So we'll refer to these two states several times this semester, but you have the fed state. That means after a meal, the body's storing the extra glucose as glycogen until reaching the maximum storage capacity. And we don't store that much glucose as glycogen in the body, just a few hundred grams. Any excess is converted into fat. Then if the cells need energy, they can metabolize the glucose to release the energy stored in the molecule. So that's fed state. And then we also have fasting state. So this is just the chemical formula of what it looks like to break down glucose and turn it into energy. So that becomes carbon dioxide and water and energy. Kind of just going full circle of life there, what it was originally. So ketosis is when blood glucose levels are low and there's not much stored glycogen around. The cells can metabolize fat for energy. That results in the production of some ketone bodies, molecules formed from the metabolism of fat that can be used as an alternative fuel for certain cells in the body when glucose levels are low. So ketosis is really an adaptive metabolic state when we don't have many carbohydrates. And that is the goal of very low carbohydrate diets, or what's called ketogenic diets. The issue with these ketogenic diets is ketone bodies in relatively small amounts are okay, but as ketone bodies accumulate, if you're in this ketosis state for a long time, you can get what's called ketoacidosis. So, which is a toxic state depending on how far it goes. But if it goes far enough, you can even lose consciousness and die in very severe cases. This occurs in individuals with untreated type 1 diabetes. Their pancreas can't produce insulin, so they can't use the glucose in their body, and their body is running off of stored fat. So that brings us to talking about diabetes. So you see the definition there, and it's really any disorder that's characterized by abnormal glucose, fat, and protein metabolism. Hyperglycemia is abnormally elevated blood glucose, which is really common in type 2 diabetics. And we'll talk about the different kinds of diabetes here in a moment. So, when you're diagnosing a patient to see if they have diabetes or not, what you're going to do is do a little finger prick where you get just a tiny drop of blood in a machine called a glucometer, which will measure the amount of sugar in the blood. So milligrams per deciliter is the metric, and in order to do this accurately, what the healthcare practitioner asks is that you have fasting blood sugar. So, often the test will be done first thing in the morning. So you've been fasting overnight. If you have normal blood sugar, it's between 70 and 99 milligrams per deciliter. 100 to 125 is pre-diabetic. Over that is considered diabetes. And just to note that the pre-diabetic condition is relatively a new definition. So I think it was about 20 or so years ago, healthcare practitioners started using that. And there's an interesting psychology there that they would get people with a bit elevated diabetes, but wouldn't meet the definition of diabetes and say, well, you don't have diabetes yet, but you should be careful. And really the patients just hear, I don't have diabetes. So it's a little bit of a psychological approach to tell people, hey, you don't have diabetes, but you aren't normal. This is a actual scientific category now that you are pre-diabetic, meaning that your blood sugars are elevated, and if you don't change diet and lifestyle, you're very likely to become diabetic. So these precise definitions of when a disease state starts and doesn't start, they're generally fairly dynamic. Scientists, public health officials make adjustments with these definitions over time. So along with looking at the precise milligrams of sugar per deciliter in the blood, healthcare practitioners also look for symptoms of diabetes. Foot pain, abdominal pain, lack of energy, confusion. Abnormal blood sugars have a lot of different effects, and some of these are more with type 1 than type 2, and we'll talk about some of the differences, but when you see the asterisk there, those are really type 1 symptoms more so than type 2. So I mentioned that in healthcare, things are very dynamic, and the healthcare concerns of one generation are sometimes different than the following generation. And if you were taking this class in the 1950s, for instance, we might spend 5 minutes on diabetes because diabetes was pretty rare in the 1950s. Nowadays, it's become much, much more common. And this slide just shows from 1980 to the present, but this trend of increasing rates of diabetes has been going on for the past century or so. And if that sounds familiar, think about how the type of carbohydrates in our diet have really changed over the last century or so. So we'll talk about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is far more rare than type 2, and the prevalence of type 1 diabetes hasn't changed much over the years. It's really type 2 diabetes that has grown a great deal. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease where the pancreas's ability to produce insulin is impacted greatly. It's a little bit mysterious about the precise causes of type 1 diabetes. There are some different theories out there. But what we know with type 1 diabetics is that they need to have an exogenous, meaning outside the body, source of insulin in order to survive. Type 2 diabetes, which makes up the vast majority of diabetics in the US, I think something around 95% of diabetics are type 2, and just about 5 or so are type 1. That is a condition that is very much related to lifestyle and diet. And that's where the cells of the pancreas produce insulin, but our cells in our body become insulin resistant. So the insulin doesn't work as well on the cells of the body. And also, what happens with type 2 diabetes is over time, the pancreas kind of wears out and produces less insulin. Another kind of diabetes, really more of a subset of type 2 diabetes, is gestational diabetes. So that's a type of diabetes that can develop during pregnancy. And essentially, it's kind of like pre-diabetes, but the stress of pregnancy, which is a very, challenge for a body, can increase blood sugars. And I worked with a lot of gestational diabetics, and they tend to be the best patients because if you don't control diabetes well during pregnancy, there can be some pretty severe consequences for the fetus, for the baby. And as well, poorly controlled gestational diabetes tends to result in a larger fetus and a more difficult and often painful birth. So my gestational diabetic patients were very careful. But what I would always talk about with my gestational diabetic patients is even after you give birth, you're going to want to follow a much more cautious diet because essentially it's a warning sign. It's kind of like pre-diabetes, that if you don't follow that diet, you're likely to develop diabetes after giving birth. The goal when treating diabetics is that they achieve and maintain normal blood glucose levels. So, diabetics will typically test their blood sugar at least once a day, and depending on how long they've been diabetic and how cautious they are, sometimes more often than that. Another way to test blood sugar is something called hemoglobin A1C, and that is done in a lab setting. That's not a home test. That looks at the average blood sugar over a period of several months. So you can do the daily testing with a blood sugar monitor to get a feel for how the ebb and flow of your blood sugar is going. And then you can do the A1C test to get more of a longer range picture. Diabetes is a disease that does react very well to good treatment. So if someone tests their blood sugar regularly and makes adjustments to their diet, they can often keep their blood sugar in a healthy range. And there you have a picture of a glucometer, a little blood sugar monitor, and it's actually really easy to test blood sugar. It looks a little scary that you're pricking your finger for blood, but it is a tiny drop of blood and you really hardly feel it, like a mosquito bite. These are the metrics just for what is a healthy A1C level. And this will often be done in a regular complete blood panel that a physician does with like a yearly checkup. I worked with many diabetics when I was doing public health work, and generally the first step, depending on how advanced the diabetes is, but if someone is in the early stages of diabetes, we try to control it with diet and exercise. And oftentimes it does respond really well to diet and exercise, but in some cases, maybe it's a little bit more advanced, or people have more difficulty following these lifestyle and dietary changes, and then there's need for medication. Usually the first medication that happens is something called metformin, and that makes the cells of the body a little bit more sensitive to insulin. And then if metformin's not quite enough, people start taking insulin shots. So they take what that's called exogenous insulin. So to increase the impact of pulling the excess sugar out of the blood into the cells of the body. So what does a diabetic diet look like? Really, it's just a really healthy diet. It's a diet that's balanced, that includes vegetables, that includes fruits, legumes, whole grains, low-fat dairy, animal protein, for those who want animal protein, um, good amount of fiber with every meal, and not too high in carbohydrates, in particular, not too high in those more refined carbohydrates, because that really makes a difference. Everything we talked about earlier, the fiber content. So, for instance, having half a cup of brown rice with a meal instead of 2 slices of white bread. The amount of carbohydrates might be the same, but the quality of those carbohydrates are really different. So some of the things we talked about earlier that were more like suggestions, like, hey, instead of having that coffee with sugar and cream and a soda with lunch and a piece of cake after dinner, those become far more important with someone with type 2 diabetes. So really at that point you want to pull way back on sugar and starch consumption and really focus on eating just the healthiest carbohydrates and avoiding those nutritive sweeteners, the sweeteners that contain calories. So these are two important definitions, particularly for people who have type 2 diabetes. Essentially, the kind of carbohydrate in the food, and then how that relates to the amount we eat, the portions we eat. So something like popcorn does have a high GI, meaning that it's mostly carbohydrate and a fairly simple kind of carbohydrate. But since it's relatively modest in overall carbohydrate content per serving, for instance, um, a few cups of popcorn still has a relatively modest amount of carbohydrate in it. It won't elevate blood sugar that much, even though it's a relatively simple kind of carbohydrate. It has fiber, it has water, and it has a lot of volume. Carrots are similar. Carrots are really sweet. They have simple carbohydrates in them, but a carrot is mostly fiber and water, so you'd have to eat a lot of carrots, even though it has a high glycemic index. It has a relatively low glycemic load. So with type 1 diabetes, insulin is obligatory. Type 1 diabetics produce no insulin, so they need to have insulin shots. With type 2 diabetes, sometimes it can be controlled well without insulin, but as the disease progresses, oftentimes insulin is needed. Organ transplants are obviously a very invasive surgery with a lot of risks. One of them being that the immune system recognizes the new organ as a foreign antigen, as kind of an invader, and so people have to take anti-rejection drugs, which are pretty strong drugs with side effects. So pancreas transplants are not super common because of these risks. That's different than kidney transplants, which are really common, and we'll talk about that in another chapter. But and the other reason that they're not as common is just because we have these other ways of treating diabetes we've talked about in the last few slides. One of the best ways to control type 2 diabetes is simply physical activity. And the reason that it's so effective, this is just such a simple reason, you almost don't need to think in the realm of science, but when you are physically active, your body is pulling glucose out of the blood to fuel that activity. So that lowers your blood sugar, just being physically active. It has an effect like insulin has. Um, it's not always a option, because you think, some elderly patients, someone who maybe is in a wheelchair or had hip surgery. It's not always an option, but when it's an option, physical activity is incredibly effective treatment for diabetes. As with a lot of disease states, it's a load on the body. So diabetes um, puts the body at a bit more risk for things like COVID-19. And you can just think the body can only handle so much. So if it's already dealing with one disease state, that second disease state is an added challenge. So just an important distinction between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is not preventable, but type 2 diabetes is to some degree preventable, and certainly we can reduce the amount of type 2 diabetics. It's gone up greatly, it can go back. We can go back to the levels that we had 100 years ago. Um, and it's everything that we talked about earlier here, right? Eating a much healthier diet, being physically active, and also some other things that we haven't mentioned as much, but getting good sleep, managing stress levels, good mental health, all of that helps. So with type 2 diabetes, we've been mostly talking about too much blood sugar, right? That's the central issue with type 2 diabetics. With type 1, it tends to be the opposite, too low blood sugar, which is hypoglycemia, which can also happen in people who aren't type 1 diabetics, but that's where we see it most often. Interesting, dogs can be trained to um, notice when blood sugar drops, which is kind of incredible, but it has something to do with dogs' ability to smell, and they can smell when a certain chemical is released that um, is correlated with low blood sugar. So the great debate here are carbohydrates fattening, and you see some really important reasons in the slide that we have to be cautious with carbohydrates. But really the answer to this question comes all down to what kind of carbohydrates are you talking about? Are you talking about barley and brown rice and ears of corn, corn tortillas, and vegetables and fruits and 100% whole grain brown bread? Or are you talking about sweeteners and pastries and donuts and all matters of refined carbohydrates? This has been a long going conversation in nutrition uh, about what exactly does addiction mean in the food setting, because you can't be addicted to food since we all eat and need food. It's different than something like alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs. So we really can't classify food as in the addictive category, but we can recognize that certain types of foods that are more calorie dense, and for instance, foods that contain sweeteners in them, are far more alluring and attractive and can create cravings and a lot of human desire. It doesn't quite reach the threshold of addiction, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't treat these kinds of foods with a lot of caution. Metabolic syndrome is a condition that increases the risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and it's really a group of signs and symptoms that occur together. So we'll take a look at a couple of those here in this next slide. So some signs of metabolic syndrome include a large waist circumference, which is different for men and women, of course, chronically elevated high blood pressure, which we also call hypertension in healthcare circles, elevated fasting blood fats, triglycerides. So when you get a complete blood panel done on your annual checkup, they'll check all of these factors actually. Low fasting HDL cholesterol. HDL cholesterol, we'll talk about that more in the fats chapter, but that's the healthy cholesterol. So if that number is low, that's also a bad sign, a part of what metabolic syndrome is, and of course, high fasting blood glucose. So you don't necessarily have to be diabetic, but you have to be in that over 100 milligrams per deciliter, that pre diabetic category. So, if everything we haven't talked about already isn't convincing enough evidence that we should be careful with the type of carbohydrates we can consume, we also need to consider the most obvious thing, which is dental health. And I remember when I was doing research in Nicaragua and interviewing people about their diets, a lot of the older folks told me that something they noticed was when they were young in the 1950s and 60s, when sugar in rural areas of Nicaragua was really expensive and rarely consumed, there were very few cavities. It was very unusual to have cavities. And they noticed over the following decades that the number of cavities has really increased. That's something that is something everybody can notice, even folks who don't necessarily know what cholesterol is or blood pressure, folks that aren't necessarily well educated about nutrition and health, they notice cavities. So lactose, the sugar that's in dairy products, is not widely digestible. And when you're looking at globally, you're talking about somewhere or over half the population of the globe, maybe even as much as 3/4 of the globe, has some degree of lactose intolerance, meaning when they consume dairy products, they have digestive discomfort. And this, to a large degree, depends on quantity. So if you're talking about a very small quantity of dairy, most people with lactose intolerance can handle it without symptoms. But when it gets over, for instance, 2 or 3 ounces of milk, when you're talking about half a glass of milk or a full glass of milk, that's too much for people with lactose intolerance. And some people are more sensitive than others. Um, so this is one of the reasons why dietitians always really have to understand what are good alternatives to dairy, what are other foods that, for instance, provide a good amount of calcium. So, to give a little perspective on lactose intolerance, human beings have only been consuming dairy products for about 10,000 years or so, and not everywhere around the globe. That habit of animal husbandry with animals where, like sheep, goats, cows, where we can consume the milk and make dairy products out of it, that started in the Middle East, Southern Europe, about 10,000 years ago, spread to a lot of areas, but not everywhere. Everyone has the ability to digest lactose in infancy, and as we age, we tend to lose some of that ability. But people from a background where dairy products have been consumed for many thousands of years tend to do a lot better with digesting dairy because of some natural selection that occurred over the last 10,000 years in certain cultures. So if we look here at lactose content, we see quite a bit in a cup of milk, right? And then a little less as you get into yogurt, cheese, cottage cheese. And the reason being, those are fermented dairy products, and the bacteria is actually consuming the lactose. That's part of the fermentation product. And some of those other products have less lactose because they have a lot of other ingredients, like ice cream has a lot of sugar in it and a lot of fat and other ingredients in it. So there's been a lot of research in this area if sugar causes hyperactivity, and so far the results are inconclusive or showing that you can't make that connection. But what I will say in general, kids that have a healthy diet, that more balanced diet, tend to have less problems all around. This is just a summary of some of the things we talked about earlier. So a high fiber diet may reduce risk of obesity, diabetes, certain intestinal tract disorders, including colon cancer. A lot of the benefits of fiber boil down to the fact that human beings we evolved to eat a far high fiber diet than we are eating now. And when we switch off of a more traditional diet, there are consequences to that. Our body simply wasn't adapted well to eat a low fiber diet of a lot of refined foods. It isn't what our digestional tract evolved to do. And fiber's benefits don't just stop at the digestive tract. So a high fiber diet is also associated with lower blood fat levels, like lower triglycerides, lower cholesterol, lower blood pressure, lower inflammation markers like C-reactive protein, and as mentioned earlier, very few of us are hitting those recommendations of 25 grams for adult women and 38 grams for adult men. We mentioned a few of these things before, but just to rehash, when food has a lot of fiber in it, you literally spend more time chewing it, breaking down the food, which helps make you feel full, and your body spends more time and energy, thermic effect, more calories in digesting that food, which both reduces the risk of obesity and just makes you feel full. A busy digestive tract working hard on fiber helps to make you feel full. And we're ending on a little bit of a tangent here, but fermentable oligo, di, and monosaccharides and polyols are short-chain carbohydrates that the GI tract may not fully digest or absorb. And some people are more sensitive than others. The book goes into a bit more detail on this. But I have worked with several patients before on looking at what a food map diet entails. And for some people, a low food map diet, for some people it can make a big difference in digestive health, and for other people, not so much.